I need to say this clearly, before anything else. I wasn't selfish. I wasn't reckless. I didn't choose the easy way. I chose what was right. And that choice followed me for the rest of my life. People like to believe that doing the right thing leads somewhere good. That morality has a reward system built into it. That if you sacrifice enough, if you act with integrity, life will eventually recognize it. That belief kept me going for a long time. It also destroyed me. The moment itself didn't feel dramatic. There was no music. No shouting. No clear sense that this was a turning point. It was just a decision made in a quiet space, with consequences I thought I understood. I didn't. I chose responsibility over desire. Duty over truth. What should be done over what I needed. And everyone agreed with me. That's the part no one talks about. No one warned me. No one questioned my choice. No one said, "This will cost you more than you think." They praised my maturity. My ethics. My strength. Their approval felt like confirmation. It should have felt like a warning. At the time, the alternative felt unbearable. Choosing myself would have hurt someone else. It would have disrupted stability. It would have made me the villain in a story where I desperately wanted to be decent. So I swallowed what I wanted. I told myself that wanting less made me better. That sacrifice was noble. That longing fades if you ignore it long enough. That last part was a lie. The longing didn't fade. It went underground. I moved on the way people expect you to move on. I didn't collapse. I didn't complain. I built a life around the decision and learned how to speak about it calmly, even confidently. I said things like, "It was the right choice." I said, "I don't regret it." I said, "Some things matter more than personal happiness." People nodded. Inside, something hardened. I noticed it in small ways at first. A flatness where excitement used to be. A dull ache when I saw Pat. Once I admitted to myself that doing the right thing had ruined me, I felt something dangerously close to relief. Not because the pain lessened, but because the lie finally stopped working. For years, I had survived by telling myself a single story: this was the cost of being decent. That belief kept everything in place. It explained my emptiness. It justified my restraint. It gave moral meaning to a life that felt increasingly hollow. Questioning it felt like sacrilege. Because if the right choice wasn't enough, then what was I supposed to live for? I began to see how deeply that decision had shaped every other choice that followed. I used it as a reference point, a moral anchor. Whenever something mattered to me, I measured it against that sacrifice. If I could give that up, I can give this up too. If I survived that, I don't need this. If I endured that loss, wanting more would be selfish. That logic became my prison. I didn't just sacrifice once. I institutionalized sacrifice. Every desire felt suspicious. Every strong emotion felt indulgent. I learned to distrust joy, because joy reminded me of what I had chosen not to have. I kept my expectations low, my dreams abstract, my attachments cautious. That way, nothing could challenge the narrative. People admired my composure. They saw someone steady, ethical, grounded. Someone who didn't chase happiness at the expense of others. They didn't see the constant negotiation happening inside me. They didn't see how often I asked myself whether I deserved relief. Whether I had earned ease. Whether it was acceptable to want something just because I wanted it. I lived as if happiness required moral permission. And I never granted it. There were moments when I almost broke the pattern. Moments when something stirred a connection, an opportunity, a sense of possibility, and I felt myself lean forward instinctively. Then the old weight would settle in. Remember who you are. Remember what you chose. Don't betray that. So I stepped back. Over time, that stepping back became automatic. I stopped noticing what I was forfeiting in real time. I only felt the accumulation later, a sense of living at a distance from my own life. I wasn't depressed. I was constrained. I began to notice something else too. I had become intolerant of ambiguity. The decision I made years ago had been clear-cut. Right versus wrong. Duty versus desire. That clarity had anchored me. But life after that wasn't clear. It was full of gray areas, trade-offs, imperfect choices. I didn't know how to live there. So I kept imposing the same binary logic on everything. If a choice felt morally complicated, I defaulted to self-denial. It was familiar, safe, consistent. That approach earned me respect. It also isolated me. I realized how alone I was with my burden. Because no one else questioned the choice anymore. It was settled history. A closed chapter. Something people referenced as proof of my character. But I was still living inside its consequences. I couldn't talk about the regret without sounding ungrateful. I couldn't express the pain without undermining the virtue of the choice. I couldn't ask for understanding without risking judgment. So I stayed silent. Silence made the burden heavier. One night, years after the decision, I allowed myself to imagine an impossible scenario. What if no one was watching? What if morality wasn't being scored? What if doing the right thing didn't require lifelong punishment? The thought felt dangerous. Because it implied that ethics and self-destruction weren't the same thing. I realized then that I had fused morality with suffering. Somewhere along the way, I learned that if a choice hurt enough, it must be right. That pain validated virtue. That belief kept me from healing. It told me that easing my own suffering would cheapen the sacrifice. That moving forward would dishonor what I had given up. So I stayed stuck, loyal to a past version of myself who had made an impossible decision with limited information and infinite pressure. I didn't allow myself to evolve beyond that moment. That's when the real breakdown began, not outwardly, but internally. I felt resentment toward my own integrity. I felt trapped by the very values I once took pride in. I started to wonder whether I had confused goodness with self-erasure. That question scared me more than any regret I had suppressed. Because if being good required destroying myself, then what was the point of goodness at all? I didn't have answers. But for the first time, I allowed the question to exist without immediately silencing it. And in that space, something fragile but important emerged. Compassion. Not for others. For myself. I saw how young I had been when I made that choice. How limited my options felt. How much weight I carried alone. How desperately I wanted to be decent, to do no harm, to be worthy of respect. I realized I had never thanked myself for that. I had only punished myself for surviving it. That recognition didn't fix anything overnight. But it cracked the structure I had been living inside. For the first time, I considered a radical possibility: maybe doing the right thing wasn't meant to cost me my entire future. Maybe survival wasn't betrayal. And maybe the most moral act left to me was learning how to live again without using sacrifice as proof of worth. That thought frightened me. But it also felt like air. Learning how to live after doing the right thing was harder than making the decision itself. Because the decision was clear. Living afterward wasn't. For years, my life had revolved around honoring that choice. I structured everything around it: my limits, my expectations, my emotional range. I treated the sacrifice like a debt that could never be fully paid, only managed. Letting myself live again felt like defaulting on that debt. At first, I didn't change anything external. I didn't leave my life. I didn't announce a new philosophy. I didn't reinvent myself. I changed something quieter. I stopped asking whether I deserved relief. That single shift destabilized everything. Because once you stop measuring your right to exist against an old sacrifice, you're left with a terrifying question: What do I want now? Not what's right. Not what's justified. Not what proves my character. What I want. That question didn't come with answers. It came with fear. Fear that wanting anything would undo the meaning of the choice I made. Fear that joy would feel like betrayal. Fear that easing my own suffering would retroactively turn the sacrifice into a mistake. I had to face something uncomfortable then. The choice I made all those years ago was real. It mattered. It shaped lives including mine. But it wasn't meant to become a life sentence. I realized I had frozen myself at the moment of that decision, as if growth beyond it would be disloyal, as if my integrity depended on staying wounded. That belief kept me morally intact and emotionally dead. The first time I allowed myself something purely because I wanted it, I felt physically ill. My body reacted as if I had crossed a line. My mind raced to justify it, to explain why this was acceptable, to prove that I wasn't becoming selfish. I almost backed out. Then I noticed something strange. Nothing bad happened. No cosmic punishment. No moral collapse. No sudden loss of meaning. Just relief. Quiet, unfamiliar relief. I began to understand that morality isn't sustained by suffering. It's sustained by intention. And my intention then and now had never been to harm. I didn't undo the past by choosing myself in the present. I honored it by surviving it. That realization changed how I saw my life. I stopped treating the sacrifice as the highest point of my character, the moment that defined me forever. I started seeing it as one chapter in a longer story. A chapter that deserved respect, not worship. I allowed myself to feel anger not at the people involved, but at the mythology I had built around the choice. The idea that goodness requires perpetual self-denial. That being right means being small. That decency demands lifelong silence. I rejected that mythology. Slowly. Carefully. Without drama. I didn't become reckless. I didn't abandon my values. I didn't start choosing myself at the expense of others. What I did was include myself in the moral equation. That inclusion felt radical. I let myself want things again, not extravagantly, not impulsively, but honestly. I let joy exist without immediately questioning whether it was earned. I stopped flinching when life offered something gentle. Some days, guilt still surfaced. Old reflexes die slowly. When it did, I acknowledged it and didn't obey it. Because guilt is not proof of wrongdoing. Sometimes, it's just evidence of growth beyond an old frame. I no longer tell people that I have no regrets. I do. But I also no longer tell myself that regret means my life is over. I did the right thing and it ruined me. That's true. But it doesn't get to ruin the rest of me too. If you're listening to this and carrying a choice that everyone else calls noble, a decision that cost you more than anyone acknowledges, I want you to hear this: you are not obligated to suffer forever to prove that it mattered. You are not betraying your past by choosing to live now. And morality does not require your disappearance. Sometimes, the bravest thing isn't making the right choice. It's surviving it without turning your life into a memorial. I didn't undo the damage. Some losses are permanent. Some paths remain closed. But I stopped confusing punishment with integrity. I stopped treating my pain as proof of goodness, and in doing so, I finally allowed myself to exist beyond that moment, not as a martyr, not as a symbol, but as a human being who made an impossible choice and lived to tell the truth about it. That truth is this: doing the right thing can ruin your life. But staying ruined is a choice you don't have to keep making. And that's how, long after the decision, I finally began again.